Hey guys, welcome back to Useless Historian. Tonight we're going back farther than maps can reach. Back to a time before writing, before cities, before anyone had a name for the sky. A time when the stars weren't just distant lights, but familiar presences, silent watchers, old storytellers. And to those early eyes, they weren't random or cold. They were necessary. Because when you live without clocks, without calendars, without weather forecasts or electricity, the sky becomes something else entirely. You watch it not to wonder, but to survive. And in those countless nights under a dark canopy, they began to understand something we've almost forgotten, that the stars meant something. So get comfortable, let your mind drift back into the dark, and let's remember what the stars once were. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and maybe share it with someone who needs a slower kind of story tonight. Let me know down in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Let's begin. The first eyes that looked up too long. No one knows the name of the first person who stared at the stars too long. Their face was never carved into stone. Their voice was never written down. But once, long before fire had a place to stay, someone looked up and didn't look away. They might have been alone, sitting near the edge of a clearing after the embers had died, or lying on their back beside a river, still from hunting, still from moving, still from trying so hard to survive. And up there, spread out above them, like something too huge to understand, were the stars. It's easy now to forget how silent the night once was. No hum of distant lights, no airplanes, no buzz of screens, just breath, just heartbeat, just wind through trees. And the stars, not the few faint pinpricks we see through city haze, but a sky full, crowded, alive. For most, the stars were background, like leaves or clouds or dirt, something always there. But for that one person, that first, something changed. They stared too long, not out of fear, not even curiosity, but the way a child stares at water for the first time, mesmerized, undone. They didn't know what they were looking at. There were no words for constellations, no stories passed down, no gods named yet, but they felt it, something deep, something that whispered without sound, "You are small, but not alone." They may have told someone, quietly, maybe a whispered thought beside a fire. Did you see it? The pattern near the moon, but it was just a flicker of thought, just a breath. Maybe others nodded, maybe no one listened. Maybe that was the first time someone felt the ache of wonder that didn't fit inside a sentence. And that moment, small as it was, did something. It stayed, because after that, others began to notice. Patterns returned, lights moved. Some stars didn't stay, others blinked where none had been, and people began to wait for them, to trust them, to fear them. But it started with one person staring too long, one person who forgot, for a moment, about hunger, or cold, or danger, someone who saw more than light, someone who felt the sky, not just looked at it. We'll never know their name, but maybe we don't need to. Maybe every time someone lies back in the grass and lets their eyes unfocus on the stars, that ancient moment echoes again. And maybe that's enough. When the sky moved like a map no one drew. They didn't have paper, they didn't have ink, they didn't even have words for what they were seeing. But still, they watched. Night after night, season after season, someone in every clan noticed that the stars didn't stay still. The sky was never exactly the same twice. It shifted, slowly, patiently, without sound or reason, but it shifted, and over time they remembered. One night, a familiar cluster would rise just above the treetops. Weeks later, it would climb higher, reach the center of the sky, and then, slowly begin to fall again, disappearing behind the western edge of the world. Another cluster would rise in its place, and so the cycle began to mean something. They started calling it the pattern, though not in words the way we know them now. The pattern was passed by gesture, by retelling, by showing a child where to point their finger. And when someone asked how long until the rains returned, or when the berries would swell on the vine, someone would look up and answer without speaking. Because the sky had already told them, it was like a map no one ever drew. A map that stretched above the entire world, bigger than any forest, older than any river. A map that wrote itself, erasing and redrawing not in minutes or hours, but across whole lives. You could age under that sky and still not know every shape it offered, and it didn't move in haste. It slid like a great animal's breath, slow, deep, unhurried, but if you paid attention, it gave you all you needed. The time to plant, the time to rest, the time to move. It gave warnings too. When stars blinked out or flared in ways they hadn't before, people took note. They lit fires earlier. They traveled in tighter groups. Some waited to see if the sky would right itself. There were no rules written down. There were only memories, stored in elders, in the way they tapped their staffs toward the horizon, or in the way their eyes narrowed when the wrong star rose too soon. Children learned to trust those silences. Not everything was explained. It wasn't supposed to be. Some things you simply watched, long enough, often enough, until you just knew. And over generations they began to follow the sky, not just read it. When the stars shifted a certain way, it was time to walk. When the moon became too thin to see, the clans knew which animals would stir. When the brightest star returned to a particular angle above the tallest hill, they knew the salmon would be running, the herds would be coming down, the warmth would begin again. No one told them this. They learned it by listening, not to words, but to the quiet, to the long silence of observation, repeated across centuries, to the kind of remembering that doesn't belong to one person, but to a people, a whole lineage of eyes tilted upward, each night folding into the next like steps pressed into earth. And so the sky became not just a map, but a mirror, a reflection of what life had become, predictable in its unpredictability, constant in its change. Some believed the sky moved because of them, that their lives were written in the stars, not as stories told in fireside tales, but as markers of meaning. When a child was born under a certain cluster, that shape stayed with them. When someone died, and a new star seemed to rise in the days after, they nodded, knowing the two were somehow linked. There was a time before the sky meant anything. But that time ended quietly, the moment someone looked up and recognized something, a dot, a shift, a pattern that matched a memory, and after that no one ever looked at the night the same way. Even now, even under our bright cities and our electric glow, some part of us remembers what the sky once was, a guide, a teacher, a quiet presence that expected nothing, gave everything, and moved above us whether we noticed or not. But for those first watchers, those early wanderers, the sky was never still. It was always in motion, not random, not chaotic, but purposeful, a map without a maker, a story without a page, and all they had to do was look up and follow. The time of counting only after dark. There came a point, long after fire had made the nights feel less hungry, and after the stars had been watched long enough to be trusted, when someone began to count. Not sheep, not coins, not even days in the way we understand them now. They counted with shadows, with stars, with absence, with the way the light vanished. No one taught them how. There was no math, no parchment, just the shared understanding that some things happened more than once, and some only once in a lifetime. And so in the dark, when all else was quiet, they began to trace the moments back, one by one. At first it was simple. You counted how many full moons had passed since the first snow. You counted how often the star beside the crooked tree had returned. You counted the days since someone left, or since someone didn't come back, and you didn't do it aloud. This wasn't counting for trade or measurement. It was softer, slower, sacred in its silence. Because in a world without clocks, the only real markers were memory and stars. They counted in rhythms, the time between firewood trips, the time between dreams, the time between one cold breath and the next. And as generations passed, the counting deepened. Children asked questions. How long until the rains return? How many sleeps until the birds sing again? How far away is the next place? And always, the answer was tied to night, because only at night did the sky offer its quiet reply. That was when the great wheels turned above them, when patterns could be felt more than seen, when the mind, no longer distracted by hunger or hunting, could finally stretch into stillness. Elders began to share stories only after sundown, and within them, often hidden in the middle, were numbers, not as we know them, not 10 or 50, but as many as the stars between those two hills, or as long as it takes the moon to rise from the river to the ridge. The stories carried the numbers, and the numbers carried the memories, and so night became the place where time lived. Day was for doing, night was for remembering, and slowly they started to shape their world around those counts. You knew when to plant based on how many moons since the frost. You knew when to rest based on how many times the wolves howled without finding food. You knew when to worry, when the star that never blinked suddenly vanished and hadn't returned in the last 12 darks. The sky didn't just move anymore, It marked. It measured. And some among them began to carry these measurements, like a gift. They didn't speak often. They didn't hunt the hardest or speak the loudest. But they remembered. The dark was theirs, not because they owned it, but because they understood it. They marked stones in secret. Not carvings, not yet, but placements. A rock leaned against another, just so to capture the angle of moonrise, a small circle of pebbles left near the riverbank, where a certain reflection returned every fifth night, patterns only they could read, and when those who counted spoke, others listened, because theirs were not just stories, they were records, of births, of losses, of migrations, of quiet miracles, like the return of fireflies, or the first sound of cracking ice. Even grief had its place in the count. After a death, you counted the nights, until the crying stopped. The nights until you could speak their name again. The nights until the fire didn't feel colder without them. And hope too was counted. The nights since a child last asked a question. The nights since someone dreamt of warmth. The nights since the last time no one was hungry. In the end, everything meaningful happened after dark. The world spun just the same, but they didn't see it, they felt it. And those feelings, shaped by the rhythm of shadows, became a kind of calendar etched not on stone, but into memory. So when the stars rose and the wind fell silent, they didn't just rest, they remembered. And they counted, because the dark held everything the light forgot. Why they believed the stars chose their path. There were no roads then, no carved signs, no markers pointing to where a valley ended or a forest began. The world stretched endlessly in every direction, raw and unwritten. And the only thing that truly moved with purpose was the sky above. So they followed it, but not blindly, and not without thought. They followed the stars, not because they were the only thing visible, but because they seemed certain, while rivers froze and thawed, while seasons betrayed them with sudden storms or false warmth, the stars kept to their paths, quietly, unfailingly, and so the people began to believe something old and comforting, that the stars chose them, that their movements, those slow, sweeping arcs across the night, weren't just natural rhythms, but messages, signs, guides meant to be read, not with the eyes, but with the soul. They noticed how certain stars only appeared when the herds began to move, how one flickering point in the sky always seemed to rise just before hunger ended, just before roots softened or birds returned. It wasn't superstition, not at first, it was survival. It was pattern recognition stretched across centuries, and in time, that pattern became something deeper, a kind of faith, not in gods exactly, not yet, but in something older than language, older than stories, direction. You didn't just walk toward a tree or a hill, you walked toward what the stars said would be there: water, shelter, a way forward. And when the way forward vanished, when the land turned cruel or the weather turned on them, they looked up again. If a star stayed steady on the horizon, they took it as a sign to keep moving. If a star blinked out or fell, they whispered among themselves, wondering if they had gone wrong, if they'd missed something, if they were being told to turn back. Sometimes they stopped altogether, setting their shelters beneath a sky that felt right. They didn't have a word for it, but they knew it when it happened, when the stars seemed to settle just so above a valley, or when a cluster of light echoed a story their elders had once told around the fire. And then they'd say, "This is where the sky wants us." Each step they took wasn't just movement, it was part of a conversation with the night, a silent back and forth, where every decision felt watched, not judged, just noticed, as if the stars were waiting to see who would listen, and who would drift off the path that was meant for them. Even the names they gave themselves, or their clans, often echoed constellations. Not in the modern sense, there were no lions or twins, but shapes, motions, the people of the reaching star, the walkers of the curve, the children of the sky touch, each name a reminder of where they'd been, and who they followed to get there. Children were born beneath certain skies, and raised to believe those stars had chosen them, not randomly, but with meaning. If you came into the world when the long-tail star hovered high, it meant you'd wander far. If your first night came beneath a tight cluster of lights near the shoulder of the northern ridge, you were thought to be a protector, a gatherer of people, someone whose presence others would orbit. It wasn't always comforting. Some stars were seen as omens. They didn't speak of them aloud. They were just watched and waited out until the sky turned again and better signs returned. But in the in-between, they stayed cautious, still, careful not to challenge the quiet rules the stars seemed to suggest. And when someone strayed, wandered into woods no one trusted, or insisted on moving during a moonless dark, they were gently reminded, not punished, but warned. Are you walking where the stars can see you? That was enough. Because deep down, even the boldest among them still feared being forgotten by the sky, left unlit, unnoticed, lost not in the forest, but in the spaces where stars refused to shine. And so they shaped their journeys by night, slept with their backs to the fire and their faces to the sky. Let children dream while pointing upward. Let old ones pass while the stars watched, believing, truly believing, that light would carry them onward. Because if the stars had brought them this far, surely they would carry them further still. The night a star didn't return. They didn't have maps. They didn't name their lands with borders or flags. They didn't measure the world in distances. They measured it in sky, in stars, in what was there when the fire died down and the silence grew wide. And of all the lights that watched over them from above, there were a few that always came back. One in particular. It wasn't the brightest, not like the silver eye that chased the moon, but it was steady, always rising low over the shoulder of the eastern hills, always just before the cold began to lift. The elders called it the Path Star, though they never said it directly. They'd nod toward it when teaching the young to walk home alone. They'd glance at it when the hunters left in silence, disappearing into the black edge of the trees. It was the kind of light you trusted not because it dazzled, but because it was always there. Until it wasn't, it began like any other night. The fire burned low, shadows stretched softly across, packed earth and hide. The air held its breath in the way it always did, when the sky prepared to speak. Someone, the oldest one still awake, leaned back and looked up, waiting for the same familiar rise of the stars across the dark roof of the world. And then, nothing. A gap, a small silence where light should have been. At first, no one said anything. Maybe the cloud lace that sometimes drifted unseen was hiding it. Maybe the star had blinked late. It had happened before, hadn't it? Or maybe they were looking in the wrong spot, though they knew better. They always knew where to look. But as the minutes stretched long and slow, something changed in the way the group breathed. Sleep didn't come. The night no longer felt like a blanket. It felt like a question. Someone whispered, "It should be there." That's all it took. One voice too soft to stir the flames, admitting what they were all thinking, that the light had failed them. And in their world, a star not returning wasn't just a trick of the sky. It was a message. No one spoke loudly. No one wept. But they shifted, subtly, unconsciously, drawing closer together. A child's hand found an elder's sleeve. A mother reached out, not for her own child, but for someone else's. The boundaries between bodies softened, as if to create a single shape large enough to resist what had gone missing. The sky didn't explain. It never did. But still they looked. They watched all night, just in case the star had been delayed, or wounded, or testing them. Some held offerings in their palms, pebbles polished by riverbeds, feathers bent by wind, teeth from animals whose names were only whispered. Quiet gifts to whatever force had once placed that star where it always rose. By the time the horizon began to grey, and the cold softened just slightly, the star had not returned. And that meant decisions would need to be made, not right away, not loudly, but soon. Because if a guiding light left the sky, then something must have changed on the ground. Elders spoke to one another in low, ember-colored tones, not of panic, but of patterns. Had something gone unseen in the last migration? Was there something in the trees? Had the animals moved too soon this year? Did someone break a rule without meaning to, or worse, without caring? They didn't assign blame. They searched for cause. Because for them, the sky wasn't random. It was responsive. It watched. It remembered. Some among them believed the star had vanished to warn them, that something was coming, or already here. Others believed the star had been stolen, taken by another group who had lost their own light and needed one to follow. There were even those who thought the star hadn't left at all, but that they had wandered too far to see it anymore. That was perhaps the most frightening idea, that the fault was not with the sky, but with themselves, that they had left the path the star had once marked, and now stood in a place not meant for them. But whatever the reason, they would not ignore it. They fasted for a day, not to punish themselves, but to listen more clearly, to strip away what distracted, and make space for signs. They watched the birds. They listened to the way water moved through rocks. They asked the wind if it still knew their names. And when night came again, They sat in silence, all of them, and watched, and again, the star did not return. That was when one of the young ones, barely grown, but with a quiet steadiness, stood and asked to walk alone, not far, not foolishly, just to a nearby ridge, where the ground dipped, and the sky opened wider. He didn't promise to find the star, he only asked to look from a different place. When he returned hours later, frost clinging to the edge of his lashes, he shook his head. But then, he said something else. I saw something move. He didn't mean an animal, he meant the sky. He had seen a slow ripple across the horizon, a flicker like a breath, being drawn, not the missing star, but something, a presence, and the elders, who had lived long enough to hear shape and silence, nodded. It wasn't the same as before, but it was something, and that was enough to keep moving. They would change the path slightly, they would stop naming the missing light, but they would carry its place in their memory, not as loss, but as part of their journey, because they knew now, the sky gives, and the sky takes, but it never forgets who's watching, and neither would they. How they knew seasons by watching the sky. They didn't count days. Not the way we do. No calendars, no months, no numbered boxes drawn in ink, but they still knew when to move, when to gather, when to wait, and when to fear, because above them, always, the sky spoke. Not in words, not even in sounds, it moved slowly, quietly. And if you watched it long enough, if you remembered what it looked like on the coldest night, or the first warm dusk after frost, then it told you everything you needed to know. That's how they knew the seasons. The world beneath their feet could be deceiving. Grass could grow early, only to freeze again. Rivers could thaw for a week, then crack with ice by morning. But the stars didn't lie. Not because they were kind, but because they didn't care. They simply were. Steady, relentless, honest. They noticed first how some stars vanished. That was the earliest sign. Not what arrived, but what disappeared. A single cluster they'd come to expect above the trees might not return one evening, not gone forever, just absent. And that absence felt important. The elders called these stars season holders. Each group of stars held the cold, or the wet, or the dryness of the plains. When one left the sky, its season followed it, or came chasing after. Some of them watched from the same rock every night. A smooth, flat slab, just beyond the camp where smoke didn't drift, and trees didn't block the view. They'd sit quietly, sometimes for hours, breathing in rhythm with the wind, waiting for the exact moment a star touched the ridgeline, or vanished into the edge of dawn. Others listened to how birds changed their songs, not just the melody, but the timing. The pause between chirps, the number of calls before silence, it all matched the shifting constellations. They didn't know it as data, they knew it as balance. And when the balance tipped, when the stars leaned ever so slightly to the south, or arrived late above the stone hill, they began to prepare. Maybe the big animals would return soon. Maybe the roots would grow soft again. Maybe it was time to gather bark before the rains turned it bitter. Children were taught not just to see the stars, but to notice them, to feel their positions as if they tugged at the body. When a certain curved line of light appeared, just above the tallest tree, the young ones would whisper, "The sleep days are ending," and everyone would nod. The seasons were not things that changed suddenly. They crept, they arrived like breath, softly, slowly, always felt before they were seen. And it was the sky that warned them. During the time of hunger, they looked for the pale, distant spark that meant berries would return. They didn't say the word for food, they simply said, "The small light is back." When it rained too much, they watched for the star with the red edge. It didn't always mean danger, but it meant to wait, to stay close, to not send anyone far without a watcher. Even the moon's tilt mattered. They marked it in stories, not carved, not drawn, but told, over fires, beneath hides, while cleaning fish or brushing dirt from seed bundles. The tale of the moon that smiled wide meant warm nights were near. The story of the moon that turned its face meant snow was coming, and they listened. Because every time someone ignored the sky, every time they walked too soon or planted too late, something was lost. A child caught in a storm, a hunt that yielded nothing, a sickness that spread faster than the hands that could cool a fever. They never claimed to understand the sky fully. That would have been arrogance, but they respected it, as if it were the oldest elder of all, the one who didn't speak much, but who always had eyes open. Some believed the stars had names, not ones they could pronounce, but names felt in the body. One star pressed against the chest like sorrow, Another bright one near the western ridge made the feet feel restless, as if it pulled at the bones to start walking. They even built stone markers, not as worship, but as memory, to know where a certain star would rise again, to measure how long it stayed. These stones didn't point to gods, they pointed to reminders. This is where the cold begins. This is when the birds will sing less. This is the night to pack your things. The seasons weren't measured in heat or snow, but in how the sky changed first. The ground followed. The world waited for the sky to move, and then it responded. So they watched, night after night, in sickness, in hunger, in love, in death. Because the sky told them how to live, and if they listened long enough, it told them how to survive. The story hidden between two constellations. Not every story was spoken aloud. Some stories were drawn, not with hands, not with paints, but with distance, with darkness, with the space between stars. Because long before stories were told by voice, they were carried by silence, and the sky was full of it. There was a story the elders only told when the fire was nearly out, when most had fallen asleep, and the stars above were so clear they felt close enough to touch. It wasn't about the stars themselves, not the bright ones everyone knew, not the wolf star or the twin hunters, or the curved path of the sky deer. This story lived in the space between them, between the familiar shapes. In that quiet space, a black stretch between two well-known constellations, they believed a secret had been hidden, not a warning, not a prophecy, but a memory so old that even the stars chose to whisper it. They pointed to the space between the river trail and the bone circle, two constellations as old as migration itself. One marked the season when the river ran backward, swollen with meltwater. The other marked the time when game bones were piled high after a good hunt. Between those two, nothing. Just darkness, just stars that never formed a shape. But that darkness had weight. The elders said that once, a long time ago, there had been a shape there, a star path brighter than all the rest, a shape that stretched like a bridge between the two, connecting water and bone, journey and rest. It was called the Crossing Flame, and it was lost, not vanished, hidden, because something had happened, a choice had been made. A fire so great, not made of wood or stone, had burned through the sky itself, and whatever was once visible there had been taken from view. The stars did not forget it, they simply chose to cover it. Some said it had been a warning, that too much was asked of the sky, that the people who came before had climbed too close to knowing things they were not meant to hold. Others believed it had been a gift, one so precious, it had to be guarded in silence. But all of them, no matter the version, agreed that when someone stared long enough into that dark stretch between constellations, they felt something, not fear, not quite, more like being watched, being remembered. There were stories about those who dreamed of that hidden space, hunters who saw the missing pattern in their sleep, children who spoke the name Crossing Flame before anyone taught them, quiet ones who sat by the coals and traced invisible shapes in the air, eyes focused not on the fire, but on the sky beyond the smoke. One girl, long ago, was said to have walked for 2 days straight, just to reach a hill where the stars could be seen without trees. She never spoke again, but she smiled whenever someone asked her about that dark space in the sky, and every night after, she placed 3 stones in a triangle before sleep, not pointing to anything, just marking absence. Some thought the story was just a way to make sense of silence, that in a world full of danger and hunger, people needed meaning in the things that didn't speak. But others believed that hidden story was still unfolding, that even now new stars were being born just beyond what the eye could see, that the sky was telling a story not meant to be finished yet, that the space between the constellations was not just where something had been, but where something was coming. So they waited, and they watched, not for brightness, but for balance, for the slight shift, the blink, the way one star pulled just a little closer to another, then backed away again, for the rhythm, because they believed, truly, that one day the shape would return, not all at once, not as fire or flame or prophecy, but as understanding, that one day someone would finally sit beside the fire and feel the missing shape settle into place, in their chest, in their breath, in the way they looked at the sky, and in that moment, the crossing flame would not need to be seen, it would simply be known, because sometimes the truest stories are not told by the light, they are held in the quiet between. When they followed the stars across ice and sand, they didn't have maps, not the kind you'd fold or pin to a wall, no ink, no markers, no written names, but they knew the way. They always knew the way, because above them, the stars moved, and the people moved with them. That was the truth of it. The rhythm of an age before borders, before the earth was broken into nations and names. They followed the sky, across everything, across forests that whispered in languages no one speaks anymore, across rivers that froze into silence, across deserts that swallowed the sound of footsteps, ice and sand, both stretching farther than the eye could hold, both ruled by sky. The first step didn't start with feet, it started with looking up. One person, usually the one who woke before others, or the one who couldn't sleep, no matter how the fire crackled, would scan the sky and find the sign. A cluster of lights just off from where it should have been, a star that had returned after too many moons away, or sometimes a darkness where there should have been brightness. They didn't name the stars as we do. Their names weren't written or spoken. They were felt. The hunter's shoulder, the eye that blinked only when danger was near, the long spine of the resting mammoth, shapes not drawn but sensed, and when one of those shapes began to tilt, to lean into the next direction, it meant it was time, time to walk, time to carry fire in stones and fur-wrapped embers, time to leave behind what had been home again, and they went, across ice first, the kind of ice that cracked beneath you but only when you stopped listening. You had to move gently, slow. Some said you had to walk like a whisper, because the ice listened, and if it heard your fear, it remembered it. They walked over that endless white, watching the stars even in daylight. They used the memory of their placement at dawn to guide the steps at noon, shadows on bone, reflections in frost. They said the sun would slide just to the left of the guardian star if the season was turning, and that was how they knew where the game would go. The sky told them where life was hiding, and when the cold gave way, not into comfort, but into heat, they found the sand. Sand was its own kind of silence. It didn't crack, it swallowed, it rolled over everything. It blurred the edge between land and sky, but the stars still stood, brighter here, somehow, more certain, as if distance cleared away doubt. In the sand they watched the way stars shimmered, the way their light bent as it passed through the heat. They learned to measure the wavering, to count the seconds between twinkles. The stars seemed to dance, but only for those who watched long enough to recognize the pattern in the sway. It wasn't just about direction, it was about memory. Each star held a season, a place, a warning. This one led to the place where water sang from the rock. That one points toward the sleeping beasts, and in the space between the stars they saw the ones who came before. They believed that when people died, not just anyone, but the ones who gave their lives in search of food, warmth, or safe shelter, they rose not into the stars but between them. They became the dark thread, the quiet guide, the gap that led the way. So when they walked across ice, they were stepping where others had stepped, even if no trail remained. And when they walked across sand, they whispered to the sky. They didn't ask for safety, they asked to be remembered, because the sky remembered everything. There were stories passed from one group to another, not of where to go, but of how to listen. One group would sing a pattern, and the next would hum it, and the third would turn it into a hand gesture, and then a footstep, and somehow, across hundreds of miles, the song of the stars continued. People who had never met each other still followed the same light. There was unity in the walking, and more than that, there was faith, not in gods, not in promises, but in light, in the idea that something far away, something unreachable, and burning and unknowable, could still be trusted. They walked not because they understood the stars, they walked because they believed the stars understood them. Why certain stars were never pointed at. There were rules in the old world, quiet ones, passed down not in words but in gestures, glances, silences that lasted just a little too long. And one of those rules was simple: you do not point at those stars. Not all stars, just certain ones. Some were safe to name, to track, even to celebrate. The long sweep of the sky deer, the 3 hunters chasing the bear, the thin belt of sisters that marked the turn from cold to wet, those were known, used, even sung about. But others you simply didn't draw attention to. You could look, yes, you could notice, but never with your finger, never with a hand. You kept your body still, you let your eyes do the watching. And if a child, not knowing any better, raised their arm and pointed, someone would gently lower it. No scolding, just a slow correction. Because the stars saw you, and certain ones didn't like being seen. The old ones said those stars were listening, not in the way people listen, but in the way forests listen, in the way rivers remember footsteps. You couldn't explain it, you just felt it, a heaviness when your gaze lingered too long, a sense that something old and unfinished was looking back. They weren't the brightest stars. In fact, most of the time, they were barely there, just a shimmer above the ridgeline, or a flicker where the sky curved down into the west. But they were steady, always in the same place, always watching. Some called them the bound stars, others, the witnesses, and there were stories, not told around children, not even around big fires, that once, long ago, someone had pointed too directly, stared too long, demanded to understand, and afterward, nothing was the same. No one agreed on what happened. Some said that person was taken, others said they simply forgot their name, that they wandered into the mist and spoke in stars instead of words, that when they came back, they wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep, wouldn't speak above a whisper. So the rule stood, no pointing. The people didn't fear those stars the way they feared storms or hunger. It wasn't dread, it was respect, the kind that came from knowing you were very small, and that something very large had decided to leave you alone, but might change its mind. Sometimes, late at night, when most were asleep and the fire had burned down to embers, a few would sit quietly and watch the forbidden stars, not to study them, just to acknowledge them. They believed those stars were holding something, not danger, but memory, that those stars knew what came before the long walks, before the first shelters, before fire, and maybe, if they were left alone, they would keep those memories safe. But if you disturbed them, pointed, spoke their shape aloud, tried to draw them in the dirt, you risked awakening something best left sleeping. There were old marks on stones far from the camps, circles, lines, patterns that didn't match any of the familiar constellations. Elders said those stones were placed by people who forgot the rule, and the stones remained, long after their makers had vanished. No one touched those stones. The children learned quickly. When you looked at the sky, you learned which patterns to follow, and which ones to leave be. It wasn't superstition, it was survival. Because in a world without walls, the stars were the closest thing to a ceiling, and you didn't poke the ceiling too hard, so the people watched. They watched the forbidden stars out of the corners of their eyes. They tracked them in breath, not in steps. They gave them no names, no offerings, no myths, only silence. And in that silence, there was safety, because sometimes, the smartest thing you can do is look away. The names they whispered for light that never flickered? They had names for every kind of light, not written, not etched in stone or carved into bone, but remembered, passed mouth to mouth. Names that belonged to things that burned, things that shimmered, and things that waited in the sky without ever moving. But the most sacred names were the ones they whispered, not for fire, not for the moon, not even for dawn, but for a kind of light that never flickered. It didn't crackle like flame, it didn't warm the skin, it didn't rise or fall. It was constant, steady, ancient. It hung just beyond the reach of understanding, always watching, always there, and for that kind of light, they did not speak loudly. They whispered. Some said those stars, the ones that never flickered, had never been born, that they were placed in the sky by the first people, or by something older than people, as reminders. Others said they weren't stars at all, but eyes that had chosen never to blink. Either way, their light was different. It didn't dance like firelight. It didn't retreat behind clouds, and it didn't ask anything of you. The elders taught the children that you could count on that kind of light, that when you were lost, truly lost, it would still be there. They didn't use it to tell time or direction. They used it to remember. That's why it had names. Not one name, many. Each clan had their own. One called it the Still Spark, another, the Breath of Stone. Some used names so soft, they sounded like sleep itself. Others said the names didn't come from the tongue, but from the chest, like breath you don't realize you're holding. They didn't say these names during the day, and they didn't shout them. You said them while looking up, while alone, while remembering someone, or while waiting for something to pass. Sometimes the people would gather in silence, staring at that one piece of light, unmoving, unwavering. No one said which name they were thinking, but everyone felt it, because this light had seen everything. It had watched the first fire catch. It had watched the rivers freeze and thaw, and freeze again. It had watched people walk away from places they loved. It had watched them return, and it had never flickered. They told stories of travelers who'd gone too far into the wild, who lost the trail, lost the stars they knew. But this light, this constant, would guide them home, not with brightness, but with trust. One step, then another, not because they knew where they were going, but because they knew what to follow, and they whispered, not prayers, but promises. If I make it back, I'll remember your name. If I don't, carry it with me. They believed the light could hold those words, that it didn't need flame or heat or wind to carry messages, only stillness. Stillness was sacred, because everything else, the wind, the hunger, the dark, the doubt, all of it moved. But the unflickering light did not, and in a world where everything changed, people grew old, shelters collapsed, rivers dried, children forgot songs, that one steady glow meant something. It meant the world hadn't ended. Not yet. So they whispered its names. Not for magic, not for miracles, but to stay connected, to stay within the story, because if you forgot the name of the one light that never flickered, you might forget who you were, and more importantly, you might forget how to find your way back. Why they waited until the moon was gone. They could have moved earlier. That's the first thing to understand. The food was ready, the water skins were patched, the youngest had been quiet, and even the wind was still. The fire had been walked in circles, packed with ash and covered with stone to last the night. But they didn't leave. They waited, not for the sun, not for a voice, not even for the stars. They waited for the moon to be gone, because there were things you did in light, and there were things you only did when the sky was clean and black, when no shadow had a double, and no creature could cast a silhouette behind it. Some said it was for safety, that predators roamed more boldly when the moon was full, that their eyes caught gleam, caught motion, caught shimmer where none should be, that even your breath, if it caught silver in the dark, could mark you. But others said it wasn't just about danger, it was about respect. The moon was a watcher, an eye, a reminder, and not every journey was meant to be watched. So they waited until the moon had shrunk to a sliver, a thread of pale that didn't even rise with dignity. And then finally, when the sky had become soft and unjudging, they began to move. No torches, no fire carried in horns or embers, wrapped in moss, only quiet feet, soft breath, and stars that looked down like old friends. They moved through tall grasses, and over stones still holding the day's warmth. No one spoke. No one dared, because the moon might still be listening. Even gone, it might remember the shape of the ones who moved beneath it. In some clans they told a story, always in low voices, always after the fire was low and the children were pretending to sleep, about a time when a hunter moved beneath a full moon. He was fast, they said, skilled, brave, but the moon saw him, and worse, the moon remembered him. From that night forward, he never cast a proper shadow again. No matter where he walked, his outline was wrong, slightly late, slightly ahead, like something else was pretending to be him. After that, people learned, you wait for the moon to be gone, if you want to leave something behind, if you want to move without being followed, if you want to disappear clean. The new moon was not emptiness, it was permission. And that night, the night when the sky had no second sun, no curve of silver, no half face watching from above, was when the people moved best. Even animals knew, you could hear it. The difference in the way the wolves howled, not for hunger, but for knowing, the way the owls tilted their heads slower, the way the trees stood straighter, as if honoring the darkness rather than fearing it. It was not blindness, it was a kind of vision that only came when nothing else lit the way. They moved with memory instead of sight. They followed the earth with their souls, not their eyes. The leader didn't need to speak. They could feel each other's movements, in the hush of steps, the shift of breath, the way the air changed shape just before someone turned, and above them, stars, tiny fires, cold and old, steady as bone. But the moon, it stayed hidden, and that was the gift, because there are some stories that must be lived, not recorded, some paths that should be walked only once, some silences that only belong to those who dare to move when no light asks questions. So they went on, through shadow, through hush, through the dark that held no face, not lost, just unseen, and for once that was exactly what they needed. The markings on stone that matched the sky. There were stones scattered across the old places, heavy, deliberate things, not the kind that rolled downhill or tumbled from cliffs. These had been placed, lifted, carried, and set into the earth by hands long gone, hands that had blistered and bled, worked in silence, and stepped back without leaving names. And on those stones markings, not deep carvings, not crude scratches. These were more like etchings, grooves just enough to catch the shadow of morning or the glow of dusk. Some formed lines, some curved like the paths of birds, some met in intersections that didn't belong to maps, but to memory, no one alive had made them. But they matched something. They matched the sky. Not the sky, as it looked on any one night, but the pattern of it, the way stars shifted in slow rhythm, the way certain points never moved, the way darkness wasn't empty, but organized, layered, alive. The old ones noticed first, not with charts or numbers, but with eyes that had watched thousands of nights unfold. They saw that the dots on stone mirrored the dots above, that if you traced your fingers across the markings just before dawn, you could feel the same direction the stars would take that night. And then the stories began. Not loud ones, not grand, quiet stories, ones whispered while sitting near these stones, hands resting in grooves that had outlived generations. Some said the stones were older than fire, that they were the first calendars, not to count days, but to remember when the sky changed, when a certain light vanished for 3 sleeps, when another returned, but one hand's width farther west. These shifts mattered. They meant cold was coming, or food, or birth, or the need to move. But it wasn't just utility. There was reverence in those markings. The people believed the sky left messages, and that the ground, like a patient student, copied them. The stones were the notes, and the markings. They were echoes of starlight, ancient reflections, a dialogue between earth and heavens. Children were taught not to trace them too quickly, not to rush. Each groove had a weight, a memory, a song, if you let your fingertips rest long enough. There were no explanations for how the old ones knew where to place them. No measurements, no tools, just trust, in rhythm, in silence, in the memory of firelit nights spent staring upward, learning the movements of eternity. Sometimes in deepest winter, when the stars felt sharper and closer, the people would visit the stones, not to pray, just to stand, to look from groove to constellation, and back again, to remember that someone had done this long before them, and that someone after would do it again. There were nights when the wind moved in just the right way, and the fire cast light across the stones, and the shadows landed perfectly in each marking, like a second kind of starlight had risen from below. In those moments, they said, you could feel the earth breathing with the sky. Some of the stones had markings that pointed toward nowhere, at least, nowhere that matched any known star. Those were the ones people approached with caution. They said those lines pointed toward what used to be constellations that had since died, stars that blinked out before the first shelters were built. The idea that light could die was terrifying, but it was also comforting, because if stars could go dark and still be remembered in stone, maybe people could too. Maybe memory didn't need to flicker. Maybe it could be carved deep, survive the cold, wait through silence, and greet someone generations later with the simple truth. You were here. The markings were not random. Each set belonged to a season, a place, a pattern of stories. One stone told when to gather roots, another told when the great birds would pass, another warned of when water would vanish from the shallow streams. But there were other stones, the quiet ones, set apart. Their markings didn't track movement, or time, or food. They matched the stillness of the sky. The same stars that never moved, the same lights people didn't point to, and no one spoke while standing near those. They just looked, listened, remembered that not all things move, not all lights change. Some truths are meant to be carried, not questioned, and some stories, like those carved in stone and echoed in the stars, were never meant to be spoken aloud, just followed, in silence, step by step, mark by mark, star by star. When they thought the stars were watching back, they had always looked up. That was nothing new. Every night the fire was quiet. Every time the stories had been told and retold, every time the silence stretched long enough to remind them how small they really were, they tilted their heads, leaned back against stone or hide or earth, and stared into the black above. But there was a difference between looking up and being looked at. And there came a night, maybe not the first, maybe not even special at the time, when one of them looked at the stars and felt something looking back. Not just light, not just cold, ancient fire across unimaginable distance, but presence, not eyes in the way humans knew them, not faces or forms, not something with breath or bone, but attention, a feeling that something out there noticed them, noticed the spark of their fire, the motion of their shadows, the brief, flickering lives they lived down here between trees and rivers and stone, and once one person felt it, the idea couldn't be unfelt. The stars became more than navigation, they became company, not gods, not yet, not judgmental, not cruel, not even kind, just there, awake, constant, witnesses. They didn't blink, they didn't speak, but neither did the elders when they listened, neither did the river when it carried the dead, Neither did the wind when it crept back into the shelter after a long journey. Stillness didn't mean absence. Silence didn't mean indifference. And the stars, they had been silent since before the first fire. And yet, here they were, every night, in the same places, in the same configurations, waiting. Some people began to speak differently around them, softer, as if trying not to interrupt something. They didn't raise voices when walking under the open sky. They didn't argue near the ridge where the stars showed clearest. They didn't lie under them, unless they were ready to tell the truth. Because what if the stars remembered? What if they recorded every gesture, every betrayal, every kindness? What if they could tell the difference between a story told and a story lived? That was the beginning of star promises, oaths made under the open sky. Some whispered into the wind, others pressed into the shoulder of someone sleeping. If I forget, let the stars remind me. If I fall, let them find me. If I'm lost, let them lead someone back. And it felt real, because they had never failed to return. Even when everything else vanished, the mammoths, the rains, the herds, even the warmth of the seasons, the stars did not. They saw the migrations, they saw the famines, they saw the births that came too soon, and the ones that didn't come at all. They watched as people changed. And maybe that was what made them feel alive. Not that they burned, but that they stayed. There were nights when the fire grew low, and no one dared speak. Not because of fear, but because of awe, because someone had looked up and said nothing, and everyone else followed their gaze. And for a moment, the camp stilled in a way nothing else could still. Even the cold stopped moving. Even the wind forgot its path, because they all felt it. Not worship, not certainty, just that quiet, immense possibility. What if they see us? The children asked about it, of course. Why the stars didn't talk, why they didn't help more, why if they were truly watching, they didn't do anything. The elders didn't answer in words, they just smiled the way old people do, when the answer isn't meant to be given, but found. And over time, those same children would sit by fires of their own, look up and fall silent. Because understanding didn't come from knowing, it came from feeling. From that shift in your chest when you realized the light above you hadn't changed in your lifetime, or your parents' lifetime, or anyone's. From the way you could name stars after you're dead, and feel them again, not as ghosts, but as witnessed. From the thought that you were not just living under the stars, but within their memory. And maybe that's why they started whispering to them. Not asking for help, not praying, just checking in. A small voice, a soft glance, a name spoken only once. Because maybe, just maybe, the stars were not cold fire after all. Maybe they were listening. And maybe, somehow, they cared. Why fire was lit only after the first star appeared? They had the wood. That was never the issue. Dry bark, wind-fallen limbs, roots pulled from old ground and dried for weeks, all carefully stacked beneath hides, kept safe from rain, from wandering animals, and from the forgetfulness of long days. They had flint, too, or what served the same purpose, a shard of stone that sparked when struck right, when angled just so. Sometimes it was passed down, sometimes it was chipped new, but it was always ready. They had moss, they had twine, they had kindling, they had every reason to light the fire before the cold crept in, before the insects disappeared, before the trees began whispering the longer sounds of dusk. And yet, they waited. They sat in darkness, not fully, for the sky still held a faded blue, but in a hush that felt like something was missing, and they didn't move to correct it. Not yet. They waited for a sign, not a drum, not a bird call, not even a word from the eldest among them. They waited for a single star, the first one, the one that showed before all others, always in the same part of the sky, always at the same kind of hour, always when the light of the world had dipped just far enough to make it visible, but not yet final. They had names for that star. Some called it the one that blinks first, others called it fire's permission. Some just pointed to it without speaking, a simple gesture that meant everything was ready, because fire was never just a task, it was a ritual. It mattered when it was started, and to begin before the star appeared, that was something no one did, not because of fear, but because of respect. They believed the sky watched, that it kept rhythm better than memory, that it saw the hearts of people, and the steps they took. And lighting a fire too soon, before the first light of the night had offered its quiet nod, was like speaking over someone who had held silence longer than you could imagine. So they waited. Children learned not to ask why. They felt it in their bodies, the way others did. That tension in the air just after dusk, but before flame. that in-between moment when every movement slowed, when no one wanted to shift and miss the first glimmer, and when it came, that tiny brightness peeking through the blue, sharp and quiet, everyone knew it was time. Someone stood, not the youngest, not always the oldest either, but the one chosen. They knelt, not rushed, but slow, deliberate, a breath in, a glance upward, then the flint, then the moss, a whisper of spark, a breath of coaxing, and soon the first curl of flame. It felt like a conversation. The fire answered the star, one light for another, one born in the sky, one cradled on earth, and as the flames grew, licking at the wood, hissing softly, dancing as though glad to be awake, the camp shifted, shoulders relaxed, voices returned, faces took on a glow that had nothing to do with heat. The day had ended, the night had been accepted, and the fire was their answer to it. But still, the lesson remained. Fire needed more than fuel. It needed timing. The belief ran deeper than stories. It was a rhythm passed through generations, wordlessly, like the rhythm of walking, or weaving, or holding a child for the first time, the kind of knowing you don't think about, you just carry. Because lighting a fire wasn't just survival, it was alignment, a promise that no matter how much the world changed, no matter how many rivers dried up or animals disappeared or people wandered away, the first star would appear, and they would wait, and they would light, and they would begin the night, not with fear, but with gratitude, for rhythm, for flame, for the understanding that some things, some very old, very quiet things, should never be rushed. And so, even in the worst winters, even when storms hovered and hunger scratched at the walls, they held to that simple truth: wait for the first star, then light the fire. Let the sky know you're still listening. Let it see your answer, soft, steady, small, but burning. How they knew it was time to bury the dead. It didn't take words, it rarely ever did. Long before rituals were passed down in structured ways, before the speaking of names or the crafting of stone markers, they already knew. It was a knowing that lived in the body, in the heaviness of breath, in the stillness of movement, in the way a hand no longer reached out to shake another awake. Sometimes the sign came in silence, a quiet that felt different than sleep, not the soft rhythm of breathing near the fire, but the kind of quiet that held no return, no stirring, no shift, just the weight of absence, suddenly present. And when it happened, no one shouted, no one screamed. The moment folded itself into the group like a shadow wrapping around stone. They could feel it in the air, a change in the temperature near the body, a scent that hadn't been there an hour ago. Not foul, not yet, but a warning. The warmth that left the skin didn't come back, no matter how tightly the hides were pulled around it, no matter how many bodies leaned close, no matter how long someone whispered the name into a sleeping ear. The oldest often noticed first, not just with their eyes, but with something deeper, a sense that came from seeing it too many times before. They didn't ask questions. They simply stood, gathered what was needed, and began to prepare. Others followed without speaking. That's how it was done, not because the dead demanded silence, but because the living needed it. They wrapped the body in layers, carefully, not out of ritual, but out of memory. Hands moved the same way each time. Hair was brushed aside, dirt was wiped from the feet. Small things, things that didn't make sense unless you'd seen it done before, or unless you feared forgetting how to do it when it mattered most. Then came the choosing of the place. Not just any ground, the place mattered. It had to be high enough that water wouldn't gather, close enough that people could return, but far enough that the fire's warmth wouldn't reach it. There were places the tribe knew, slopes between trees, soft shelves of earth tucked between old stones, sometimes marked by previous burials, sometimes not, and when they carried the body, they did so slowly. Not out of sorrow though that was always present, but out of care, the way you carry something that once held laughter, or song, or stories, whispered to a child at dusk. There was no fear in the carrying, just reverence. Some left tokens, a stone the person had always held, a bundle of roots from a shared hunt, a shard of flint shaped by their hands. These weren't offerings to gods, they were messages, to say you mattered, you were known, you will not be forgotten. When the burial was done, they sat nearby, not in mourning the way it would one day be named, but in stillness, letting the fire call them back when it was time, letting the stars notice one less face, letting the night carry away the last of the breath that had once joined theirs in laughter and warmth. And after, when the fire was lit again, and the stories returned to their place in the night, someone might speak the name, not loudly, not sadly, just enough to remind the group, and maybe the stars above, that the person had lived and had meant something. They didn't mark time in days, they marked it in the space between breaths, and when one ended for good, they knew, not from clocks or rules, but from the quiet that lingered after. That was when it was time, not to say goodbye, but to return someone to the earth that had carried them all. Why the brightest star meant something would change. They didn't need to point it out. Everyone saw it. The brightest one, the star that appeared not just earlier, but stronger, whiter, sharper, like a blade pressed into the sky. It wasn't always in the same place, but it always arrived alone. First, before the others dared show themselves, and every time it did, something shifted. Even children noticed. They might not have had the words for it, but they'd fall quiet when it came. A hand halfway to a bowl would pause, eyes would lift, voices would drop. The brightness wasn't just light, it was a signal. That was the star their ancestors had watched too, the one their great-grandmothers had whispered about in the hush before sleep, the one elders glanced toward when they were unsure, when decisions had to be made, when storms were coming but hadn't yet touched the air. It had always been the same, too bright to ignore, too strange to understand, and always followed by something new. Sometimes the change came as weather, a wind they hadn't felt in weeks, or a sky that cracked open with ice when it should have been rain. Other times, it was birth. A child born under the star's eye always grew up, marked, sometimes in greatness, sometimes in strangeness, but never unnoticed. People would say, that one came with the bright star, and that was enough, but the change wasn't always clear. Sometimes the star meant someone wouldn't return, that a hunter's trail would go cold, that the river wouldn't unfreeze on time, that a face you knew well would soon become just a shape in memory. The brightness didn't promise good or bad, only different, only soon, and so they watched it with quiet attention, not with awe like the full sky, not with affection like the moon. The brightest star got a different kind of reverence, the kind you give to messengers, to signs, to things that don't explain themselves but still demand listening. Some of the older ones said it wasn't a star at all, that it was a watcher, not a god, but something like one, something that had chosen not to speak because words would only make things smaller, that its brightness was the only language it needed, a language of timing, of tension, of truth, without story. You couldn't ask it questions, you couldn't offer it gifts, all you could do was see it, and know that something in your life, or someone's, was about to move from the world you understood into one you didn't, that the rules might stretch, that paths might turn, that a plan you'd carried for seasons could vanish like breath in cold air. They never looked at it too long, not out of fear, but out of instinct. It wasn't meant to be stared at, just acknowledged, like nodding to someone you didn't recognize, but felt you should. That brightness in the sky was never framed in ritual. It simply was, a fact of the world, like hunger, like fire, like loss, and yet, in its appearance there was also comfort, because no matter how harsh the change it brought, no matter how deeply it unsettled things, it proved something bigger than their worry still existed, that patterns were still being followed, that the sky still remembered. So they tracked it, not with tools, not with names, but with breath, with the way a song stopped short, with the pause between stories, with the way someone's hand gripped tighter around a child's back as the fire burned lower, and when it vanished, when the brightness finally faded, and the sky returned to its usual scattered quiet, they exhaled, not with relief, but with readiness, because whatever was going to change had begun, and they were still here, still watching, still lit by fire, still listening for whatever the brightness had chosen to leave behind. The line of bones that faced a star no longer there. No one knew the name of the people who placed them. The bones had rested there longer than memory could reach, longer than stories dared whisper, longer than the trees that now leaned around them had been saplings. But they were there, arranged, deliberate, undeniable. A line, a shape, not buried, but resting, not scattered, but chosen, all facing the same place in the sky, not the sun, not the moon, but a single point, a place in the heavens that had once held something, a star. They could trace it back, not with certainty, but with enough shadow guessing and story stitching, to know that once a bright light had lived there, brighter than most. One of the fixed ones, the kind that didn't wander or flicker, a star that rose and set with the season, always at the same angle, always in the same breath of sky, and all the bones, the skulls, the ribs, the arms folded across the chest, were angled toward it. The people who found them didn't disturb them. They sat with them, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, sometimes for entire nights, watching that empty patch of sky as if the star might return. It never did. Some said it had died, burned out, or fallen. Others said it had moved, that it had grown tired of watching and wandered away. And a few, the older ones, the ones with silence in their voice, said the star had only ever been for them. The ones who'd left the bones, that when their story ended, so did the light. But why had they faced it? Why had they chosen death with their eyes turned upward, not toward family, not toward fire, but toward that one cold point in the sky? Some believed it was a path, that the star showed them where to go after this life. A beacon, that if they lay just right, in just the right way, with their faces lifted to that eternal place, they'd rise into it, not as light, but as memory. Others believed it was a warning, that the star was something more, a judge, a watcher, that even in death you did not turn away, that you kept your face open to it, to show you weren't afraid, or to ask for mercy. And then there were those who thought it was love, that in some long-lost age, that star had been the only thing that stayed. When rivers dried, when fire failed, when tribes vanished, when names were forgotten, the only light that never moved, that never betrayed them, that never looked away. So they had chosen to rest beneath it, and now, it was gone. The star that had outlived their words, had not outlived the sky. What did that mean? For the bones, for the watchers, for the ones who came later, who still crouched by the ancient ridge and ran fingers over brittle rib cages and wondered what kind of hope could point itself towards something that no longer existed. They didn't rearrange anything. They didn't take pieces or map them. They simply made room for silence, for stillness, for the haunting thought that maybe once long ago people knew exactly where to look when they said goodbye, and that maybe they weren't saying goodbye at all. Maybe they were waiting for the star to return, for the sky to remember, for something lost to find its way back. And maybe that was enough to explain the line, the pattern, the hush in the earth around them. Maybe bones remember more than we do. Maybe they're still facing something, even if we can no longer see it. Why dreams were blamed on falling stars? No one called them stars. Not at first. Not the ones that moved, the ones that fell, the ones that drew lines across the night, like something had scratched the sky too hard and left a glowing scar. They weren't like the others, the steady ones, the watchers. These were different, sudden, wild, brief, and yet it was those the people feared most, because those were the ones that stirred the mind. Dreams weren't spoken of lightly, not then, not when the world was still wrapped in rawness, when fire was young and sleep was a place you entered with caution. They didn't think of dreams as fragments of thought or wandering memories. Dreams arrived, they intruded, they took hold, and they weren't always yours. The old ones said they came from above, when someone tossed and whimpered in their sleep, when they woke gasping with eyes wide and a name on their lips. People didn't rush to comfort them. They looked at the sky. They watched for signs that something had passed by overhead, a streak, a shimmer, a falling light that cut across the stars like a warning or a message. Because that's where the dreams came from, they said, from stars that couldn't stay still, from lights that lost their place, from pieces of the sky that tumbled too close to earth and brushed against the soul before vanishing forever. And when a child had the same dream 2 nights in a row, the elders would whisper, "It's because the sky touched them." Not every touch was gentle. Not every star came bearing gifts. Some dreams were too sharp, too real, filled with things no waking mind could invent, voices that didn't belong to the tribe, memories from before they were born, fires that burned in unfamiliar places. These dreams didn't fade by morning. They clung, like ash on skin, like cold in bone. Those who dreamed too much were watched, not with suspicion, but with unease, because if the sky had marked you, there was no telling what else it would ask of you. Some became wanderers, others became healers. A few stopped speaking altogether, as if too many voices now lived in their mind, and all of them, in some way, had seen a star fall the night before the dreaming changed. Some said the falling stars were pieces of gods, not the kind that needed temples or names, but raw forces that couldn't hold their shape. But when they broke apart and touched earth, they spilled fragments of thought, and those fragments were caught by sleeping minds. Some caught joy, others caught sorrow. A few caught madness. All were changed. Dreams were a kind of fire, they believed. you had to handle them carefully. You had to know when to speak them aloud, and when to let them dissolve quietly. The wrong dream at the wrong time could shift an entire season, stop a hunt, delay a journey, or worse, guide someone into a place they were never meant to go. And so when someone spoke of a falling star, the tribe fell silent. They waited to see who would begin to stir at night, to see who would wake with a word on their tongue they didn't remember learning, to see what the sky had decided to leave behind. Because the sky never let go of anything gently, it always fell fast, hard, brief, and dreams were its way of reminding them that even in sleep they were being watched, that the stars, even when they burned and broke, still had something left to say. And every now and then, someone would listen, and not everyone who listened came back the same. That's why they blamed dreams on the falling stars, because it was easier than believing the darkness inside them had always been theirs. How they counted generations with the sky. They didn't have names for centuries. They didn't use numbers to hold the past in place. There were no calendars carved into stone, no scrolls, no ledgers. What they had was the sky, not just as a map, but as memory, as a clock slow enough to stretch across lifetimes, yet exact enough to carry meaning that never faded. When people asked how long ago something had happened, a birth, a death, a great fire, a walk that never returned, the answer was always upward. They pointed to where a certain star had risen back then, to where the moon had bled on the night a child was born, to when the belt of stars overhead sat low enough to skim the mountain, meaning snow had come early, and so had grief. They didn't say 5 generations ago, they said, when the stars tilted the last time, or the winter after the twin comets danced, or simply, in the season the sky held its breath. To them, the heavens weren't passive. The sky breathed, it watched, it moved with purpose, and in its patterns, they saw their own reflections, stories layered over years, lives folded into the sweep of constellations that told of who had come before and who might still return. The eldest among them could read the sky the way some read faces, not just in stars, but in absence, in how long a certain one had stayed hidden, in how fast another seemed to blink, as if agitated or trying to warn. They would point and say, "That light flickers faster now, like it did when my mother's mother first bled." A moment encoded in motion and light. The seasons had their signatures too. They weren't kept on bark or etched in stone. They were remembered by where the stars sat when the birds left, or when the river shrank, or when the berries soured too soon. Even death had its sky. People knew, somehow, when the shape of a soul lifted into the darkness, when the clouds felt like curtains parting, when the wind grew still enough for a star to pause. They passed this knowledge without ink. Through stories, yes, but more through practice. A hand guiding a child's chin upward, a voice asking, "What's missing tonight?" and letting silence carry the weight of memory. Sometimes a song followed, a soft tune with only a few words humming a path between fire and firmament, a lullaby made of sky, and every once in a while something new appeared, a star no one remembered, a glow with no name, and that's when someone younger would be marked, a child born under the sky with the stranger, or the time when the heavens had too many eyes. That child's life would not belong to themselves alone. They'd carry the name of that night, and whenever it came again, if it did, those around the fire would say, "It's been as long as a life." That's how they counted, not in years, in returns, in echoes, in the arc of light, across a life once lived, and so their memories stayed enormous, larger than single lifetimes. Time was a circle of stars above them, turning slowly, predictably, beautifully. When someone forgot the name of an ancestor, they didn't grieve, they simply waited for the night sky to remind them, to tilt just so, to shine in a way that hadn't happened since that ancestor walked the earth, and then they would say it aloud, the name, the story, the place in the sky. And just like that, the memory would belong to them again. The sky was more than above them. It was with them, and in it, generations waited, not lost, not gone, just rising in patterns the living still knew how to read. When a new star meant a new rule, it never just appeared. A new star came slowly, or so it seemed, like it had always been there, just waiting for the right set of eyes. The sky didn't announce it. There was no thunder, no omen in the wind. Just one night, someone pointed up and whispered, "That wasn't there before," and everything changed. Because in their world, stars didn't just exist. They meant the sky wasn't a place of passive beauty. It was a scroll that wrote itself slowly across the generations, and every light held a place, a purpose, a memory. So when a new star arrived, it didn't come as decoration, it came as a message. Or worse, a rule. The people would gather, not in fear at first, but in deep silence. They watched it from behind fires, letting the light bounce from their eyes up into the cold. Elders said little, the young said nothing at all. No one dared speak its meaning too soon. Because a star that arrived without permission might carry weight no one was ready for. They waited to see where it would sit, near the hunting stars. Then maybe the rules around the hunt would change. Was it nestled near the stars of shelter and safety? Then perhaps it meant the hearth had to be moved, or that the old sleeping place was no longer blessed. And if it hovered in the part of the sky they called the place of bones, where memory was stored, where loss had once sat like a fire gone cold, then the rules that governed death itself might have shifted. Stories would rise in its glow, caution wrapped them. Someone would say, the last time the sky changed, the river rose too soon, or when my grandmother saw a light like that. No one spoke for 3 days, and slowly, rituals began to form. Just in case, a new pattern, a new law, something quiet and unseen, woven into how they gathered berries, or how they left offerings at the edge of a path. A small rule at first, but always followed, because to ignore a star's arrival was to tempt everything that held life together. Children born under a new star were watched differently, not with fear, but with something quieter. An expectation, as if the light had chosen them, and sometimes it had. These children grew up surrounded by silence and stares, and they learned not to ask why, because the sky didn't offer explanations, only reflections, and those reflections were often clearest in those too young to carry old fears. Some years, the star faded, as if satisfied, as if its message had been received. But even then, the rule remained. No one stopped what had been started. If food had been offered a certain way, it continued. If songs were sung only after dusk, that became law, and if the star hovered year after year, brighter and bolder with each season, then it no longer brought a rule, it became the rule. There are still places in the world where people build without measuring. They just wait for the sky, for where the new light shines, and they shape their homes, their paths, even their stories according to where it first appeared. Some stars last only a generation, others last forever, but each one, when new, shifts something below, not because of what it is, but because of what they know it must mean. The sky doesn't offer gifts without cost, and a star never arrives empty-handed. It carries silence that must be honored, and in that silence, a rule is born, one that will live longer than the people who first saw the light. Why they believed the stars could judge. They didn't call them stars the way we do now. They called them watchers, eyes, witnesses, not distant and cold but near, aware, always above, always seeing. They believed the stars didn't just light the night, they remembered it. Everything done beneath their glow, every word whispered when the fire burned low, every promise, every lie, all of it stayed with the sky. The stars, they said, could judge, not in the way people judge, not with scowls or sentences. The stars didn't punish, they revealed, they mirrored, they tilted ever so slightly until a person was forced to see themselves by starlight, and that was enough. The ones who lied under the open sky never truly slept, not deeply. They rolled in their hides, mumbling, eyes flickering open, always searching upward, not out of fear of animals or cold, but because they knew something was watching that would never forget. You couldn't undo a night under the stars. They held your truth too well. Judgment didn't come quickly. The stars waited. That was what made it so powerful. You might think you'd escaped something, a theft, a cruelty, a broken bond, but seasons later, the stars would shift. One would rise earlier than expected, or another would dim. That's when the elders would say, "It's returned, the sky remembers." People turned their faces away from the sky, only when they were hiding something. That's how others knew. Guilt showed not in tears but in lowered chins and sleepless nights. Children were taught early, if you're proud of what you've done, look up. If you can't, ask yourself why. There were stories of people who disappeared after too many nights, sleeping under the wrong constellation, not taken exactly, but undone, as if their own shame made their feet stop walking, and their breath forget how to warm itself. And always the stars were blamed, not with anger, with respect. It was their judgment, the people would say, not cruel, just complete. Some believed each person had a star tied to their soul, not a birth star, but a watching one, a twin light that blinked only for them. And when they strayed too far from who they were meant to be, that star grew restless, shifting, brightening, a signal, a reminder. Some tried to outrun it, moving their camps or building shelters with no view of the sky. But you couldn't truly hide from your own witness. When someone died, the tribe waited for their star to respond. Sometimes it flared brighter, as if proud. Other times, it dimmed and vanished, as if ashamed. That's how the people knew what kind of life had been lived. The funeral fire might burn low or tall, but the star was the final word. And when a child was born during a falling star, a sign of change, of reckoning, they were watched closely, not feared, not adored, but tested. The falling ones didn't just light the sky, they brought judgment with them. Change wasn't always wanted, it came anyway. Over time, rules were formed. No fire was to be lit under a weeping sky. No major journey begun on a night when too many stars blinked, and above all, never make a promise beneath a sky you can't face again, because the stars don't forget, and neither should you. That's why people sat facing the heavens during their trials, not to speak to gods, to face the lights that remembered everything, that held still, even when memory faded, that glowed, even when hearts grew dark. They knew the stars would hold them accountable, long after stories were lost. Judgment wasn't fear, it was light that didn't flinch, and that was enough. The shapes in the sky that decided the hunt. They didn't need calendars to know when to hunt. The sky told them everything, not just the seasons, not just the moon. The shapes, those wide, slow-moving constellations, told them where the herds would run, when the birds would vanish, when the fish would thicken in the streams. It was not superstition. It was experience turned into story, passed down through voices and firelight, until the stars themselves became maps etched in memory. There were no drawn charts, no etched lines in stone, just stories that always began the same way. When the hunter rises, so do the deer. Or, if the sky's bowl tilts before the frost, the great beasts will go east. These weren't metaphors, they were instructions. For them, the stars didn't just watch, they led. The sky above wasn't cluttered like our modern skies. It was sharp, vast, alive. Every star had a place, every place had a meaning. The hunter constellation, a massive arc of stars with one crooked arm, only became visible once the days shortened. When it rose above the trees, the elders whispered. Soon, it meant the animals would begin to move, the ground would harden, and the time for waiting would end. Sometimes, the sky held warnings. If the constellation they called the Scattered Bones came too early in the season, it meant poor luck. The herds would split, the game would be lean, and hunters might return empty-handed. If the great antler rose before the new moon, the stories said, the hunt must be delayed. To act too soon was to offend the balance. The sky gave its signals, and you followed, or you paid the price. No decision about the hunt was made without looking up first, even if tracks had been found, even if bellies were already growling. If the stars weren't in the right place, they waited. Patience wasn't a virtue, it was survival. They had seen what happened when the sky was ignored. Whole bands had gone hungry chasing what wasn't ready to be caught. Children learned to spot the shapes before they could walk far. Parents pointed with their chins while grinding roots or stretching hides. See that? That's the tooth of the wolf. It means the boar will fight this season. Those three in a line. That's the path the geese take before the snow. The night sky was not decoration, it was direction. The shapes changed as you watched them over years, not fast, not suddenly, but enough that old hunters would squint and say, that star leans farther south than it used to. That meant something. Maybe a migration path had shifted, maybe the weather would follow a new rhythm. They didn't argue about it, they adjusted, because the sky didn't lie. It just moved on its own time. Even fire building followed the sky. On the night before a hunt, the coals were banked softly, as if not to offend the watching lights. Quiet settled over the camp, no loud stories, no laughter. The flames burned low, respectful. It was said the stars listened more closely just before dawn, and that the hunters who slept with heads uncovered dreamed clearer paths the next day. Some stories told of stars disappearing right before a disastrous hunt, a shape they'd relied on, gone without warning. Those were the times they came back with nothing, or fewer than they left with. From then on they always checked twice, not just that the shape was in place, but that it shone strong. A dim star meant hesitation, a flicker meant caution. Some even believed that certain animals followed their own stars, and that only those who recognized the right pairing could track them. The shapes in the sky decided more than the hunt. They decided who would lead, who had the sharpest memory, who could name the most lights, and link them to real movement in the world below. You didn't lead by strength alone, you led because you could see what the stars said before anyone else did. And when someone was lost, taken by a fall or a frost or a wound too deep to speak of, they looked up to find where the stars had broken apart. They called it the split sky. It meant someone had been taken, and it meant the next hunt would have to bring not just food, but peace. When food finally came, when blood steamed in the snow and hands worked quickly to clean and carry, the sky was thanked, not with ceremony, but with stillness. The oldest hunter would look up, nod once, and say nothing. That was enough, because they all knew, without the stars, there was no hunt, and without the hunt, there was no life. What the elders said before the star turned red. It was never just the color. Not at first. Long before the star turned red, before anyone tilted their head back and whispered warnings into the cold, the elders had already begun to speak, quietly, indirectly, the way people do when they know something is coming but aren't ready to say it out loud. They spoke in memory, not prophecy, reminders wrapped in old words, watch the fire that watches back, or when a light grows warm, don't mistake it for safety. They didn't shout. Elders never did. They just told stories at the edge of sleep, when the flames were low, and the night pressed close. They spoke of red stars that once appeared, and what followed, the herd that didn't return, the river that rose too fast, the year the children were born too early or not at all. They never said it was because of the star, only that the star had been watching when it happened. That's how you knew it mattered, when they said things like, if the light shifts, shift with it, or don't be the last to notice what's changed. It wasn't idle wisdom. It was a warning with roots. So when the younger ones first noticed the glimmer above the trees, just slightly different, just a hint of something warmer, they asked, "Is that star new?" And the elders didn't answer directly, they just turned their faces away. That was answer enough, because a red star was never about color, it was about timing, position, pattern. It was about how a cold, steady light suddenly pulsed like it remembered blood. The elders said that stars could carry memory too, not just of the sky, but of what had happened below. And when a star turned red, it wasn't changing. It was remembering, something it had seen once long ago, and it wanted to see it again. Some thought it was anger. Others said it was grief, but no one saw joy in a red star. The last time one had glowed that way, the ground had cracked in the southern plains. Whole paths gone, a trail of fire from below. The animals refused to cross it, and the people had to follow the herd into unknown forest. Many never came back. So this time, the elders spoke more clearly. They said not to camp near trees that leaned too much, that stones near the river's edge might not stay where they were. They reminded people to count their food and gather more than they needed, and to carry water at night, because when the sky changes, the earth remembers. People began to act slower, move softer. Fires were lit earlier, burned longer. Children were kept closer. The hunters left in pairs, not alone. The women who gathered roots returned before sunset, even if the baskets weren't full. The red star wasn't always visible. Some nights it slipped behind clouds, or hadn't yet risen, but they still talked about it. Its presence shaped the silence between conversations. It was the thought in the pause, the shadow in the doorway, the hush that followed laughter, and when it came back again, brighter now, unmistakable. The elders said something that made even the strongest pause. This has happened before, but not in your lifetime. They told the story of when the red star came during a summer too cold, and how the birds laid no eggs, or when it came during a spring flood, and how the firewood floated away with the shelters still half built. And once a time even older than they could remember, when the star bled red for 3 nights and no one spoke its name. That was when the bones were found stacked at the foot of the hill, as if someone had tried to bury memory with silence. But the star had remembered. They always do. That's why the elders taught not just what to do, but when to listen. You didn't wait for the color to change. You listened before. That was the whole point. A red star was not a beginning. It was an answer to questions you hadn't asked loudly enough. So they taught with stories, not commands. Because a story could last longer than panic, longer than memory, even longer than the star. Why they slept? Only when the sky was still. They watched the sky the way others watched fire, not for beauty but for change. It wasn't about constellations or omens. Not exactly. It was about movement, stillness. the way the stars held their breath before something shifted, because once, long ago, something did move, and they had never forgotten. They never wrote it down. It didn't need to be. The memory was stitched into habit, into the rhythms of the camp. If you asked the elders why no one slept until the sky went quiet, they might smile gently and say, "That's just how it's always been." But the firelight told more. The way they stared at the horizon before bedding down. The way someone always sat up just a little longer, eyes scanning upward, waiting for the right kind of silence above. The sky wasn't always still. Some nights, the stars flickered in ways they weren't meant to. They jittered, shifted, not visibly, not enough for a child to notice, but enough that those who'd been watching their whole lives could feel it. A hum behind the stars, a tremble under the pattern. And those nights, no one slept. They'd stay gathered, not speaking much, just near the fire. Sometimes the fire was big, sometimes barely there, but its presence meant someone was still watching. Someone was awake to see if the sky would settle. The oldest stories say that once, a long time ago, something moved in the sky, not like a star or a cloud, something bigger, slower. It crossed the night like a shadow across a pool. The stars blinked and changed color as it passed, and when it was gone, 3 people were missing. That was enough. From then on they learned the sky must be still before sleep, not silent. The sky could sing, the wind could hum, but still, no strange colors, no red where red didn't belong, no shapes out of place, no flickers that felt wrong. Some said it was the gods who walked when the sky moved, others said it was the dead, trying to return. One story said it was the earth itself dreaming, and when the dream turned restless, the sky forgot to hold still. And if you fell asleep under a restless sky, you might become part of the dream too, and never come back. So they waited, they wrapped themselves in skins and kept one eye open. Children were taught from a young age how to pretend to sleep when the sky wasn't right, to keep their breathing slow, to lie still, but never truly let go. It was a kind of patience passed through generations, not out of fear, out of respect, because they had learned that stillness above meant safety below. When the stars finally settled, when their glow steadied and no strange haze curled along the horizon, someone would nod, just once. That was the signal. You could rest now. You could fold yourself into the warmth of the group and let go of the breath you'd been holding. Some said the stars were like animals. They responded to attention. If you watched them long enough, they behaved. If you ignored them, they grew wild. That was why there was always a watcher. Someone old, someone quiet, someone who knew what stillness should feel like. And when that person finally lowered their gaze, when their shoulders dropped and they turned from the sky, it meant the world above had calmed, that the night would pass without change, that dreams this time would be just dreams, and nothing more. The path in the grass that followed the constellations. There were no trails marked with stones, no carved arrows on tree trunks, no signposts, but they always knew where to walk, not because the ground remembered them, but because the sky did. And so, over seasons that changed without names, a path formed, not paved, not worn by countless feet, but hinted, gently, softly, by the way the tall grass leaned. The wind moved through it differently there, as if it had been taught to part, as if something older than memory had once passed that way, and the world had never quite forgotten. They called it the sky's road. Not everyone could see it. Children sometimes tripped over it, outsiders walked past it, but the ones who knew how to read the stars, they could follow it without even looking down, because the path in the grass followed the constellations, each step aligned with the lights above, not by accident, not by hope. It was intention, slow, patient, built over generations, a way of walking that mirrored the movements of the sky. Each year the same stars rose, and each year the people rose with them. They learned which lights marked the time for gathering roots, which ones signaled when the rains would come, which stars to walk toward when the cold began to stretch across the land. They knew when to leave, when to wait, when to pass quietly, because the stars were not just high above, they were patterns stitched into the shape of their lives. When a new hunter joined the group, they were taught not with maps, but with stories. The elders would wait for a clear night, then tilt their chin toward the horizon. That shape there, that's the foot of the sky runner. You follow that when the moon is low, it will take you to the elk, but only if you walk slow. They didn't rush on the sky's road. You moved with rhythm, with breath, with the same pace the stars seemed to drift across the black. If you moved too fast, the grass closed behind you. The wind didn't part. The world didn't recognize your presence. They said the sky had memory, but only for those who honored its pace. There were places along the path where people stopped, not because they needed rest, but because the stars did. Places where the horizon lined perfectly with certain constellations, where the reflection of stars landed in the surface of still water, where standing stones cast shadows that pointed to where the next fire should be built. No one claimed those places. They were not owned, just understood. When someone was lost, they looked to the sky, not in panic, in trust. The stars didn't give directions, but they gave reminders. If the hunter saw the wrong shape rising, they knew they'd drifted too far west. If a star blinked out behind cloud, they waited. The path didn't want to be rushed. In winter, when the stars burned sharper, colder, the path became more important. The snow could hide the world, but never the sky. Even when the wind screamed, the stars whispered, "Go this way." Not yet. Wait until the third star rises beside the crooked branch. It wasn't instruction, it was inheritance. Some said the path had been made by those who came before, not just people, but others. Beings who walked the sky first, and then left traces below, and the path in the grass was their echo. That's why no one spoke loudly while walking it. Voices were kept low. Songs were hummed in rhythm. Steps were measured by the rise of star after star, constellation after constellation. When the grass bent in the right direction, it meant you were on the true road. When it didn't, you waited for nightfall again. And when the constellations dipped below the trees, the people rested. Not because they were tired, but because there was nowhere else to go. Not until the sky rose again and showed the next shape, and the grass remembered where it should lean. When they thought a god had fallen from the sky, it was a night like any other, until it wasn't. The stars had taken their places, familiar, steady, silent, the kind of sky that gave no reason for worry. Fires burned low in every circle, stories were folding into silence, and children drifted off with their heads against their mother's ribs. The air was cold, but not harsh. There were no warnings in the wind, no strange shapes overhead, just the usual breathing of the dark, and then something fell. It didn't make a sound at first, not in the way people expected. There was no roar, no thunder, just light, blinding, slow, and too heavy to be a star. It moved differently, slow at first, then faster, then slow again. And it pulsed, not like a fire, but like something alive. They said it left a smear in the sky, a trail of broken starlight, jagged and orange and wrong. Everyone saw it. Even the blind old man near the edge of the camp lifted his head and whispered, "It's too low." Some cried out. Some fell silent, but no one looked away because it didn't vanish. It hit. Far off, somewhere beyond the trees, a thud rolled through the earth, not like thunder, like something landing, like the world had made room for it, whether it wanted to or not. The elders were the first to rise, not in fear, in duty. One of them spoke a word that hadn't been said in years, a name that no child understood. Another retrieved an old wrapped bundle, buried beneath a flat stone, a pouch that smelled of cedar and ash. The people gathered, no one argued, no one asked questions. They all knew what had been passed down. If something fell from the sky, it wasn't a thing. It was a being, and if it was a being, it was either lost or sent, and either way, it needed to be met. The group walked without torches. Light would have been offensive, they said. Whatever had fallen from above must be allowed to rest in darkness. They stepped softly, brushing frost from leaves, ducking under sleeping branches, moving toward where the stars had changed. The forest was different there, warmer, quiet in the wrong way. The animals had fled, but the air was thick with something else, not danger exactly, not smoke, just presence. They found the crater in a clearing that hadn't existed the day before. Trees leaned outward, roots exposed, and in the center, a stone, not jagged, not charred, smooth, black, still warm. They didn't touch it. No one needed to say it aloud, but they all knew this wasn't a stone that belonged to the earth. This was a message, a mistake, a memory from a sky they could no longer trust. Someone began to hum, softly, an old tune, one meant for guiding spirits. Another added a harmony. The elders circled the object, casting dried sage into the wind. They whispered apologies, welcomes, warnings. It wasn't clear whether the god that fell had come to help or judge. One child, not old enough to know better, stepped forward. She looked into the stone and saw her own reflection, but her face blinked back before she did. They pulled her away gently, gave her a new name that night. One that meant watched by the above. The crater never cooled fully. Even days later, when the winds blew cold and the frost returned, the center remained damp and warm. Birds avoided it. The wolves howled at it. The people gave it a wide path. Not in fear, in reverence. They didn't want to claim it. They wanted it to feel free to leave. It never did. But over time, moss grew around its base. Vines crept close. Children stopped asking questions, and still when someone died, their body was carried past the crater first, just in case the god inside was waiting for company. The story changed each time it was told. Some said it wasn't a god at all, but a child sent from the stars who forgot how to fly. Others claimed it was the sky's way of warning them that another change was coming, a shift in light, a turning of warmth, a long winter that only the stars understood. But they all agreed on one thing. From that night on, the sky was not just a ceiling of stars, it was a place where something could fall, and someone might be watching from the other side. Why no one spoke when the sky shifted too fast? They weren't afraid of the dark. Not really. They knew the shapes in it, the patterns, the comforting rhythm of stars rising and setting. The slow arc of night was something they counted on. It told them when to wake the hunters, when to prepare the roots, when to sing, and when to sleep. They trusted the sky like others might trust a heartbeat, steady, dependable, always there. But when it moved too quickly, that was something else. It didn't happen often. Maybe once in a generation, maybe less. But when it did, no one talked about it. Not afterward, and certainly not while it was happening. The first time a child saw it, they thought they were imagining things. The stars weren't blinking, but shifting, like something was pushing them gently from behind. The constellations dragged slightly to the side, not where they had been the night before, not where they should be, and not just one, all of them, moving together too fast, just fast enough that the world seemed to tilt, and the silence that followed wasn't chosen, it just happened. The firewood crackled less, the wind pulled away, people gathered tighter without speaking, pressing shoulder to shoulder, trying to become smaller, trying not to draw attention, because if the sky was moving faster than it should, then something must be chasing it. Elders would glance upward, then look away immediately. Their faces said everything. Don't ask, don't look too long, don't point. Even the dogs lay flat, ears down, eyes closed. It wasn't just fear, it was understanding. Deep, old, passed down without words. Because long ago, before the stories became quiet, there had been a night when someone did speak during a sky shift. They called out, pointing upward, demanding an explanation from the gods or stars or whatever lived beyond them, and the sky answered. The stories never agreed on how. Some said lightning struck a tree with no storm. Some said the fire went out in an instant. Others claimed that the speaker's voice simply never returned, that the sound itself was taken from their mouth and buried in the wind. No one tried again. So the silence became the rule. If the sky started moving too fast, you listened, not to each other, not even to the fire, but to the space around you, to the stretch of air between stars, to the quiet that warned of change. Some said the sky was not ours, but borrowed, that we watched it only because it allowed us to, and when it moved fast, it was remembering where it came from, or worse, where it was going. Children were taught not to panic, just to be still, to lie flat and close their eyes, because movement in the sky invited movement below, and sometimes the earth responded. Once, during a sudden shift, the trees began leaning, not from wind, but as if following something above. The next morning, a line of birds was found motionless in the river, their wings folded neatly, eyes wide open, no marks, just stillness. Another time, the moon itself blinked, just once, but hundreds saw it, and no one ever spoke of it again. They had words for fire, for the cold, for hunger, but they had no word for this, just a hush that fell like snow, covering everything. A shared silence, a choice not to disturb whatever had momentarily turned its attention downward. And when the sky slowed again, when the stars settled into their familiar places, crawling softly from east to west, only then did breath return fully to the camp, only then did someone stir the fire, only then did the humming begin again. But no one ever said aloud what had happened. They just looked at one another with tired, grateful eyes, and remembered why silence sometimes speaks louder than fear. The daylight stories the stars left behind. They said the stars never truly left. Even when the sun rose, washing them from the sky, they lingered, not as light, not as shape, but as memory. The stars carried stories, and when they disappeared into daylight, those stories didn't vanish, they simply slipped beneath the surface of the world. You had to know how to see them. Not with eyes, but with the mind. At dawn, the elders would sit near the edge of camp, where the sunlight was weakest and the fire still had a voice. They would close their eyes and speak the shapes they'd seen during the night, not as maps, not as constellations, but as reminders. A star that blinked 3 times before vanishing meant a birth, a slow-moving one meant a journey, a red one that didn't move at all meant something old had returned. These were not ideas made to be written. They were felt, passed from voice to ear, again and again, until they lived in the bones. Even as the sky brightened and the birds began their calls, the elders' voices remained slow, steady, recounting not what happened on the ground, but what they sensed above, messages that couldn't be held, only received. Children sat nearby with half-shut eyes, tracing shapes into the dirt with their fingers, guessing which star had meant what, guessing which story would return the next night. It wasn't a game, it was memory work. A quiet kind of study, because when night came again, it was their turn to look up, their turn to listen. Sometimes, the stories from the stars didn't match what happened on Earth. A glowing streak might be followed by a day of silence. A pulse near the moon might bring unexpected laughter. And that was part of the mystery. The stars didn't predict, they reflected. They held the shape of thoughts too wide to say aloud. The daylight didn't erase what the stars gave, it translated it. The rustling of leaves in still air might be a leftover echo. A breeze that smelled like old fire might mean a message hadn't yet faded. The shadows cast at noon, if long and thin, could mean something forgotten had returned. They believed that stars left behind more than heat. They left reminders, traces like threads tangled in the tall grass. You didn't always notice them, but if you stopped, if you really watched the world with the same patience you gave the sky, the signs were there. A pattern in the cracks of a dry riverbed, the way smoke twisted in sunlight, the moment 2 crows landed on the same branch and didn't speak. All these were daylight stories, fragments the stars had no time to finish before they slipped away, and it was your job to finish them, not to invent, but to remember. In some camps, they left offerings in the morning, not for the sun, but for the night just past. Charcoal lines drawn on smooth stone, a piece of dried fruit left where moonlight last touched. Words whispered into cupped hands and released toward the sky, even though it was blue now. And when people passed each other in the morning, they didn't ask how they slept. They asked, did you see it, or did it change? And everyone knew what it meant. Not every day held a story. Some were quiet. Some skies were too cloudy, too stubborn. But even then, even in the grey, someone would sit and stare into the place where stars had once been, trusting that some tale was still unraveling, just in a language they didn't yet understand. Because the stars didn't need to be seen to be remembered, and the best stories were the ones that didn't end when the sky turned bright. They only grew quieter, waiting for someone to carry them through the day. The one star, they said, would never fade. There was one star they spoke of differently. It had no name you could speak aloud, no shape you could draw into the dust, no fixed place in the sky you could point to with confidence, and yet they all knew it. Not by sight, but by feeling. It was the star that never moved, never dimmed, never forgot them. Some said it was the first light the world had ever known, not the sun, not fire, but something older, deeper, a light that had waited in the dark before anything else began. It watched as people learned to walk upright. It watched as hands struck stone against stone. It watched the first fire catch, and it did not blink. They said the star had been a promise that no matter how long the night stretched, no matter how far the tribe wandered, it would still be there, waiting, watching. But the strange thing was, you could never find it if you looked too hard. If you strained your eyes or tried to map the heavens, it slipped from view. It lived between constellations, between moments. It showed itself only when you weren't seeking it, when your breath had slowed and your thoughts were quiet. It revealed itself to the ones who kept watch at night, to the firekeepers too tired to sleep, to the children who woke up in the dark and didn't cry out. You might see it once in your life, maybe twice. And when you did, it wasn't a flash or a flare, it was a soft knowing, like recognizing a face in a crowd without remembering how you knew them. And once you saw it, you understood why they whispered its story. why they never gave it a name. It was too big for a name, too still for a word. It wasn't meant to be owned or called or praised, just remembered. They said this star watched over the dying, not to guide them, but to witness them, to carry the final breath of those who couldn't be buried, the ones lost to snowdrifts, to rivers, to fire, to time. When a body couldn't be honored, they sent a thought toward the star instead. That was enough. That was the ritual. And when a child was born, they'd place the newborn outside the shelter, just for a moment, under the open sky, not to warm them, but to show them, that one, that's the light you belong to. Even if you forget it, it won't forget you. During storms, when all other stars vanished behind clouds, they would hum softly, as if reassuring themselves the one star was still above them, hidden but unshaken. They didn't believe it could be lost, only obscured. Some believed the star wasn't above at all, that it wasn't in the sky, but inside, carried in the heart of every person who had sat beside a fire, closed their eyes, and listened to the wind. A memory that was born with you and flickered faintly until your last night, when it would rise again to greet the dark, just as it always had. Others claimed it had faded once, long, long ago, and that the world had nearly ended. Crops failed. The moon stayed low. The fire wouldn't take. People wandered, unable to find home, because home was not a place, but a direction, and the star had been their anchor. They said it returned only after someone, no one remembered who, stood alone on a hilltop, and forgave the sky for leaving. After that, the light came back, but they didn't speak of that often. Forgiveness was hard, easier to believe the star had never left. Around the fire, when stories grew slow and words became scarce, someone would eventually look up and murmur, "It's still there." And no one would answer. They didn't need to, because whether the clouds covered it, whether their eyes were open or closed, whether they were young or old, afraid or calm, the story was the same. The star remained, unmoving, unfailing, unfading. Why the stars still know more than we do? They've watched everything, before the first roof, before the first word, before anyone had the thought to draw lines in the dirt, or name the sound of the wind. The stars were already there, not just above, but around, holding the shape of time, before time had a name. They don't speak like we do. They don't hurry. They don't argue or forget. They don't need to. The stars are slow, but they are constant, and in that constancy, they remember what we've lost. They remember the ones who slept under open skies without fear, the ones who knew, without being told, when to plant and when to move. The ones who could glance upward and tell you what would happen days from now, not because they predicted it, but because they remembered how the sky whispered. We built roofs, then walls, then cities with lights so bright we forgot the sky was still speaking. We moved indoors, we stopped looking up. We told stories about stars, but we stopped listening to theirs. And yet, they still wait. Even now, behind the clouds and the noise and the brightness, the stars remain, watching, marking, measuring the slow drift of everything, waiting for someone, anyone, to pause long enough to notice that they're still telling the truth. Not a truth in words, but in pattern, in rhythm, in light that left its home long before we had one, in the gentle reminder that not everything changes, that some things can be trusted, that we are still part of something we didn't build, and never needed to. The stars remember what we forget. They remember where we came from, what mattered before urgency drowned stillness, before we rushed toward destinations without knowing where they led. They remember the shape of us, not our bodies but our lives. The quiet circle around a fire, the hush before a story, the way faces softened when turned to the sky, the feeling of knowing you weren't alone, even if you couldn't name why. And maybe that's why we still look up, even if we don't know the constellations, even if the names have changed or been lost, even if we can only catch a few glimmers between buildings or clouds. Something in us remembers, something deep, older than memory, older than fear, a thread that still connects us to the slow-turning map above. So when you look up next, even just once, even just briefly, know this: you are seen, you are known, and somewhere far above, or maybe just inside, the stars are still telling the story. The same one they've always told. They know more than we do, and they always have.